Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on Fast Track to Leveraging Object Storage. Before we begin, I would like to get some housekeeping items out of the way. In your control panel, you'll notice a chat window to ask questions. Go ahead and ask questions throughout the webinar. This is going to be a real informal, conversational webinar, so please do ask questions throughout, and the presenters will answer them for you. We will also be asking a few polling questions, so we encourage you to answer the questions and appreciate your responses. And also, you'll notice an attachments and links section. We have preceded that section with some great material and a good explainer video on object storage, and you can download those and read those after the webinar. So we have 60 minutes scheduled. We're going to go ahead and try to cover most of the information in 40 minutes, leaving a good amount of time at the end for Q&A. But if for some reason we do not answer your question or you don't want to ask it, you want to ask it at a later date, just go ahead and feel free and follow up with us. We'll share our information at the end of the webinar. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Adrian Herrera. I'm the VP of Marketing at Caringo. I've done a number of webinars, so if you've viewed a Caringo webinar before, maybe you've heard my voice. With me today is John Bell, and John, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm John Bell. I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer here at Caringo, and my responsibilities typically cover assisting customers with planning, turning up, and then moving into production their object storage solutions.
And John brings just a tremendous amount of experience in deploying object storage solutions. This is, we're really glad that he can join us for this webinar today. So if you do have any questions, now's the time to ask him. He has been involved in probably the majority of our object storage deployments for the last, 5-6 years, John?
Around 5 years. Mm-hmm.
5 years. So a source of information, and he's going to be doing the majority of the presentation. I'll be asking him some questions throughout. So, our goal with this is really, to provide an overview of the information needed for a rapid and successful evaluation of object storage. We're going to really try to keep this general. We'll share some Caringo-specific information, but this really is meant to give you the tools you need, the questions you need to develop your test plans, to develop your evaluation plans, and then we'll make some suggested next steps afterwards. The reason we're doing this is that, object storage is more than just storage. You can't just treat it as you would a normal traditional storage device. We live in this new age of the cloud where everything is connected, and the associations between information are incredibly important. There's a paradigm shift going on. It's more about the data versus the application. The old world was more about the application, just using storage as a target. Now it's really about the data and the associated information about that data, metadata. And it's about protection and management. It is about web scale. I think you can go to any number of sources and they'll tell you how quickly information is growing and how, we'll have zettabytes of information. But, looking at it from a very personal perspective, organizations of all sizes are struggling with just not overall capacity. They're struggling with file count and being able to find information, and more importantly, determining what information has value to them, and sharing that information. And it all has to do with RESTful interfaces or access over the web or over HTTP. And in this new world, automation really does trump structure, because you need to rely on automation to be able to handle all these massive data sets. And of course, it really has to do with providing infrastructure as a service, or services, data services in general. And then you have a lot of different options for packaging object storage, whether it's an appliance, whether it's software-based. Even in the software world, you have open source, you have commercial applications, and then you have the questions about, okay, how do I get information on my object store? And John, can you add any color on the paradigm shifts you've seen and what you've heard customers talk about when they're thinking about object storage?
Certainly. I'd focus primarily on that second bullet under the paradigm shift column. What we're seeing and what we're hearing from our customers in the field is metadata and data being equally important, and in some cases, the characteristics assigned to the data, the metadata itself, actually being more important to them. This ties into their needs related to being able to easily search through and analyze an extremely large set of unstructured data that they've ingested into the object storage solution. And more importantly, knowing that the metadata associated with that data, given its importance, is being equally protected by the solution. And that's one of the strengths that Caringo Swarm brings to the table when you're talking about object storage. We treat the protection of metadata and data equally. There's no separate metadata store that may end up being corrupted or lost sitting outside of Swarm. Metadata and data are fully encapsulated and managed by the Swarm solution, and that's a key feature to focus on if you're evaluating object storage solutions for your organization.
Yeah, and it's a key feature, and it really is different than the way you evaluate a traditional storage, which is why we're focusing on this. We have seen a lot of very innovative companies come and focus on object storage, evaluating object storage, and we really studied and helped them through developing their evaluation and test plans, and we're going to share some of that information with you today. Overall, what we're going to go through is a framework for successful evaluation, and it really covers these 5 points that you see here. It's, okay, who do you need on the evaluation team? What are the guidelines for workload and use cases, integration and access requirements, network and authentication and authorization requirements is very important. Network is very important with object storage, and you can really view object storage as a massive web server or even a massive supercomputer. Object storage does cross a lot of paradigms. Storage may even be a misnomer for all the functionality that object storage provides. And then all the different deployment options. And again, we'll share with you, questions that you should ask, things you should look for, and John will share some really good experiences that he's had deploying object storage for a lot of the world's largest organizations. And with that, we're going to go ahead and try to push out our first polling question. And it talks about, or the question is, when do you plan to evaluate object storage? And I'll go ahead and start the voting now. So if you can, go ahead and try to vote while we move forward. It should show on your screen now. Hopefully this doesn't bring down the question, but I'm going to switch to the next slide. The question should still be up. And here's the ideal evaluation team. So John, maybe if you can walk people through the ideal evaluation team, who they should have on the initial evaluation team, or maybe this is better said, the characteristics or the expertise of the employees they should have evaluating object storage.
Certainly. Of course, you're going to want to have people on the evaluation team that are well versed with the storage systems that you're currently using. So your storage administration team or your system administration team is going to be a key stakeholder in this process. In addition to that, anyone associated with your networking group, your networking expertise within your organization is going to want to be part of this team as well. Swarm, as we'll go through in more details later on, depends very much on TCP/IP networking. It depends very much on access via RESTful protocols. And there are also some site preparation considerations that come into play when it comes to areas such as addressing plans and basically name and numbering schemes. So it's good to have them on board from the very beginning and have that plan ready to go. Most importantly, of course, you want to have your business stakeholders involved, the end users, the people that will be using this solution, and the management team that's going to be assisting you with items such as budget and general planning, items related to the impact of data migration, so things of that nature within your organization. How do we get from point A to point B when deploying an object storage solution? All of those areas will be key in participating in this process. You'll also, if you have the resources available, want to include your development operations group, people that are used to putting together the glue logic that may be necessary to allow the object storage solution to participate in the overall business workflow. They typically come into play if there are any direct integration needs, but they may also be useful to have if, for example, say you have a DevOps team that's used to working with Amazon S3 protocol. We offer an Amazon S3 protocol personality with our solution, so they would be a good fit within the evaluation as well. It all depends on how you want to use it, how you want to access the data within object storage, how you plan to migrate the data into it from traditional storage sources, and so on.
So, John, go over like the size of evaluation teams that you've seen, maybe for a small organization, small business of a few hundred people, to some of the large organizations that you have interaction with, some of the global, like the federal government and very large organizations. I mean, how large are these teams in both scenarios?
Sure. For typical small and medium business, the evaluation teams may range from what we call a one-man band, a single person that's coordinating everything for the evaluation within the company, up to some of the larger organizations where the baseline skill sets and the areas that we've outlined are more compartmentalized. So you have more people involved because that's their specific area of expertise, and you're working with a larger team. It can be an interesting mix. We've had what some would consider very large customers, like say a major telco, and the people that we're working with or the team that we're working with may only amount to one or two people. We've had smaller organizations that, because of some of the regulatory guidelines that they've had to address as part of the evaluation, the evaluation team is very large and expands into areas such as legal and finance and other areas within the company that you may not have thought about when you first set up the solution for them to evaluate. So it really does depend on the customer's individual needs, what their goals are, what problem they're trying to solve with an object storage solution, and from that you basically derive the characteristics of the team, what it's going to look like.
Good. That's good information. The next topic is guidelines for workload and use cases, and the overall reason for this is that object storage is extremely tunable. Typically, even though most vendors now offer hardware or a hardware appliance, you still have the flexibility of downloading the software. And these are really the questions that John has come up with for helping you determine, okay, how do I evaluate the workload and use cases? Do you want to walk everyone through these, John?
Sure, and we touched on the first one already. What problem are you trying to solve? It can range anywhere from a customer has heard that object storage is something that they need to be looking at, and they would like to work with us to determine, how do I work with it? How does it change, the way that I do business versus working with traditional storage? Or they may have a very specific problem, and they know that they need to make a move to object storage. They they're going to make a strategic change to moving away from traditional storage to a more RESTful approach. Typically that happens when they realize that the mountain of unstructured data that they have to handle within their organization is a much larger set of overall data versus their traditional databases and so on, and they realize that perhaps a traditional storage solution is simply not going to cut the mustard when it comes to the problems that they're trying to solve. From a perspective of performance requirements, a lot of people find that when they're working with object storage, some of the traditional performance metrics that are usually used for storage, such as IOPS, things of that nature, may not necessarily apply to an object storage solution. You may be looking at performance requirements or performance metrics more related to the number of concurrent sessions that are opened up with the cluster. How many applications are using those concurrent sessions versus end users? Do you have a need for a 24/7 sustained load, or are your loads going to be more peak in nature? Things like that. From a capacity requirement perspective, we're looking for things such as how much data do you plan to ingest? And associated with that, what kind of protection scheme do you plan to use in the object storage solution when you ingest that original set of data? Because the overall capacity requirement for the solution is going to be driven by those two factors. An example of that would be, I plan to ingest 500 terabytes of original data from another storage source. I want to protect it with reps equals 2 replication. That means the actual capacity footprint for the solution would be double. It would be 1 petabyte. Just a very simple example. So these are the type of things that we try to look for up front. Anticipated growth rate, we definitely want to take that into account. It's been our experience in the field that a customer's unstructured data growth rate is typically very large year over year, and the reason they're coming to us to begin with is because that's a very real problem for them, and they're running out of space in their more expensive storage solutions to put all of that unstructured data, and they don't want it eating up any more of that than it have to, and an object storage solution lends itself to what we call that drain the swamp scenario. You want to move this data that may be written once but read hardly ever, but due to policy or other regulatory drivers, you're obligated to keep it. You don't want that eating up your expensive storage as a result. So an object storage solution lends itself to that type of problem. Are you replacing an existing application, or are you creating a new one? It's always good to know up front if this is a greenfield implementation, something that's being brought up from scratch, or if you have a suite of applications such as a backup farm or similar that you're trying to migrate from traditional storage to object storage. Knowing those things up front is always going to be helpful. Defining the life cycle of the data that you want to store, since Swarm in particular has the capability to automate data management over time with what we call a lifecycle management, the life point headers that can be associated with the data. You can program in those policy characteristics into Swarm as the data is ingested and let Swarm manage that for you, so it doesn't require any manual intervention. So if we know of any kind of lifecycle requirements for the data ahead of time, such as I need to store this for 7 years, and then after 7 years it needs to be deleted. That's a very simple example, and that's something that could be easily implemented with an object storage solution like ours. Can you define the service level agreements that are associated with the data you want to store? Again, that's an expansion on the previous bullet. You may have other SLAs associated with that related to backup and recovery, disaster recovery, business continuity plans, things of that nature. We're going to want to take into account all of those inputs when we're working with you on the proof of concept and designing the ultimate solution for the object storage deployment.
Yeah, and I think good advice here is to actually, if you do this homework in advance without any sort of vendor influence, you'll get the best results. A lot of the times we already see customers come to us asking for a specific way to do something like erasure coding or protection, and they think they need something, absolutely need something, because another vendor told them they need it. Which is why, if you understand the problem you're trying to solve, there's usually lots of different ways to solve those problems. And, if you do this legwork in advance without vendor influence, you'll really get the best results from your deployment and your evaluation.
That's a really great point, Adrian. Typically, where we see POCs run into issues is where they've pigeonholed themselves in that manner. And I totally agree. Having the most flexibility by having the least amount of vendor input into that process ahead of time is going to give you the best results.
Yeah, and that kind of segues into integration and access requirements. Okay, we have the information we need on workload and use cases, but now how do I use it? How do I get my existing data sets onto the object store? And John, can you walk everyone through that?
Sure. So you have your native or traditional object storage access method, which is going to be RESTful. It's going to be HTTP. Your typical verbs for HTTP: get, head, put, post, delete, things of that nature, or similar verbs for Amazon S3 API if that protocol personality is available. Typically, when you go that route, you're looking at native integrations, or you're perhaps looking at migrating things that you were doing with somebody like Amazon to an in-house object storage target. And you usually have, like I mentioned earlier, some kind of development or DevOps team that manages that process, that set of requirements for you. From a more traditional storage perspective, you also have connectors that are able to provide SMB or CFS and NFS protocol personalities for access into the object store. If you go that route, there are certain characteristics around the way that data is used and manipulated by applications and clients that you need to take into account, such as is the usage heavily oriented around block level file modifications. Does it need to walk the file and keep a pointer in the file constantly, versus the other scenario where you write once and read hardly ever? Are those file share workloads predictable? Can the expected usage be profiled? Because the connectors that provide this translation for you have resource requirements as well. And being able to profile the usage ahead of time will tell you what kind of resources the connector needs in order to properly perform its function. Even if you are choosing to go a more conservative route with the traditional access protocols, it's worth investigating at that time. Can those applications or the client accesses in general be moved to a more HTTP-based access in the future? Can you migrate to that over time? And you want to see flexibility in that regard, where, for example, data is ingested by an NFS connector, but on the back end, you still want to be able to reference it with a native RESTful call. And then last but not least, are there any third-party software packages that you may require to do the data integration or the data migration? These are all the things that you're going to want to look at for your integration and access requirements.
And John, we have our first question from the audience. It's a good one. It's based upon integration and access requirements. It's about backup targets for object storage, and they're currently using EMC data domain, and their concern is they have 5-to-1 or 15-to-1 deduplication ratio. So using object storage would require them to use 5 times or 15 times more object storage. And although that may be the case if you don't have data domain involved, you should be able to plug data domain through to object storage based on the standard storage protocols, correct? SMB or NFS?
Yeah, I think this question is more along the lines of that very first bullet. What type of problem are you trying to solve? What I'm seeing in this question is that you have a data set that lends itself very well to deduplication. And there are going to be other data sets that may not necessarily lend themselves well to deduplication. The example I like to give is not everybody's going to have the same X-ray, right? you're gonna have differences, and when it comes to things like video capture, image capture, things of that nature, realistically, what you're working with is a large data set where the objects are guaranteed to be unique. And your data deduplication solution is not going to be able to help you there. In fact, we've had many customers come to us who have those type of deduplication solutions in place that are asking for assistance because they are putting the type of data that can't be deduplicated into that storage solution, and that storage solution as a result is filling up way faster than what their anticipated run rate was. And they need to move all that data off into a solution that's better suited for that type of data, right? So, there are certainly situations and pieces of data where they lend themselves well to deduplication, but not all of them do. And that's something to bear in mind when you're evaluating these type of solutions for object storage.
Yeah, so if I could just summarize what you said, you can use less data domain by just focusing on those applications or those data sets that do have a lot of replication in them. And then for the rest, you can use object storage. But even for those other use cases with data domain, you should still be able to use object storage in the back end, correct? Through the standard storage protocols?
This isn't an either-or question. You can use both in tandem. And like I say, that's what a lot of the customers that have this type of situation who have come to us, that's what they end up doing. They have their expensive deduplication storage that they use purely for the type of data that lends itself well to deduplication, things like email and whatnot. And then they have the large unstructured data set that sits in the object data store, because those things tend to be unique.
And I think that's good to point out, because if people evaluated object storage 3 years ago, 4 years ago, a lot of the message from the vendors was, hey, you kind of need to rip and replace out your storage. Now there's been a lot of advancements as far as protocol support and integration into specific applications where you can use it as a second tier of storage and really make it seamless to your current workflows. Would that be a fair statement, fair characteristic?
I'd say that's fair, because you're seeing a lot of these vendors that have these type of solutions starting to offer things like S3 offload, and that allows that solution to basically you can go in and say, I want to take this data, I don't want it to actually be here, I want to offload that to an S3 target. Well, if the object storage solution like ours does offers an S3 protocol personality, that's a great way to do it. You have a built-in de facto industry standard way of migrating that data, tearing that data off into an object storage solution, and freeing up the deduplication pool for things that lend themselves well to being deduped. That's
spot on, and a great segue to the next slide. This is really just an example of broad protocol support. So if we can point to one of the major advancements in object storage for all vendors in the past 2 years, this is what we would point to. And it's really the integration into existing storage devices, traditional technologies like, file systems, integration with pseudo standards like Amazon S3, and also into other platforms like Hadoop, like the whole Elk stack, Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana, and others. This is what we would point to as where innovation is happening, and this really helps you with evaluation of object storage, rapid evaluation of object storage. You just heard John talk about, it isn't an either or scenario when you're integrating object storage. You can really use it in conjunction with a lot of the applications you use today. Just you use less of those applications. John, would you have anything to add to that for this particular slide?
Oh, certainly, especially in the section where we talk about tearing to and from NetApps and Windows filers. We get a large amount of interest there. People find themselves in a situation, for example, where they have this large set of unstructured data that's just making a huge footprint on their expensive Windows and NetApp filers. and they want to be able to free that space up for other uses. And the situation they're facing is, do I put down a lot of money for NetApp expansion? Do I put down a lot of money for expensive Windows filer expansion? Or can't I just shunt this data off to something that's cheap and deep, but at the same time make the access for that data still look transparent to the end users and applications? And that specifically is where our FileFly capability comes into play, where we're able to do that level of data tiering, yet still make the access transparent. As far as your user community is concerned, you see the files there on the filers. You can still list them. You can still see their names and everything. It's only when they try to access them and read them that the data gets rehydrated from the object storage solution back into the native filer. And then when the migration tasks run again on the periodic basis, it just gets remigrated again and frees that space up. It's a really simple but powerful way to manage your costs and your overall storage within your environment.
Yeah, that's good information. And now, moving along is a topic that we can probably host a whole webinar on that most people don't automatically think of when they think of object storage, but it's network and authorization and authentication, right? So, if you can walk people through this slide.
Certainly. So as we mentioned earlier, your object storage solutions, these are typically large clusters. They're using RESTful APIs that talk over TCP port 80. So they're going to have some requirements around laying out your TCP/IP network, and there's going to be some planning that's associated with that, not only for the numbering, but also all the way up into DNS or equivalent for name as well. And you want to have a plan for that ahead of time, especially if you want to be able to serve this up in a web server-like manner. For example, there would be some planning, up to and even including the structure of your SSL certificates. What you want the SSL structure to look like for HTTPS. You're going to want to have structure around things like fully qualified names in general when you deploy these solutions, just so that it makes it easier to access these things by name and have the coordination with DNS as a part of that. At a lower level, at the layer 2 level, I like to call it, there's also some planning that needs to be done around segmentation of the traffic. It's definitely recommended that you have a dedicated storage VLAN switch, whichever one works best for you, for the storage traffic on the back end. That isolates that traffic to Swarm, that allows it to have basically full run, full advantage of the performance that's associated with that within that switch backplane. And it also allows you to set up the necessary layered protection and associated policies that go with that for access to the data within the object store. And that leads us into our next section, of course, which is around authentication and authorization. People may not realize that solutions like Swarm can support multi-tenancy. We can serve up a single cluster and segment the data within that cluster on a per tenant, per domain, or even per bucket basis. Very, very fine granularity all the way down to the object level. If you have a need like that, that's something that you're going to want to have as part of your test plan. You're going to want to evaluate that capability and make sure that you can set up the policy structure the way you need it to be. Do each of the tenants that you plan to put in there, do they have specific quotas or service level agreements that are associated with the data that they plan to store in the solution? And you're going to want to develop things like policy and quota management around that. Do you need to integrate with your LDAP or Active Directory stores? You need to make sure that whatever you're evaluating has the capability to do that. Swarm, of course, has the capability to integrate with LDAP or Active Directory stores and use them for user authentication. Do you want to serve up token-based authentication? And this typically comes into play where, specifically where we see this leverage frequently, is where people are using the S3 protocol personality. which, traditionally that's a token secret pair that's used to access the store, and that's something that we support. So you're able to access it in that fashion. These are all the things you're going to want to have in mind when you're thinking about how you're going to integrate the object storage solution into your network, into your user structure for authentication and authorization and so on.
Yeah, and I think these are really at the heart of, when we opened up, we talked about a paradigm shift or enabling the cloud age, and this is really, at the core of enabling that, and where it really differs with some traditional storage technologies. The ability to plug into your standard enterprise identity management solution and provide token-based access for, over the web secure access. This is where a lot of people get hung up on the network and authentication authorization, but this is really what makes object storage more strategic. This is what really transforms it from being a cost center to something that can really add value and be a profit center. Enable new data services, enable secure access. We have a lot of customers that are using our solution in a self-funded way. They provide storage services to researchers or organizations or business units in a way where they can really fund their storage growth. And this is really at the heart of it.
Right. And to that end, we even have customers who are managed service providers that are using the object storage solution to serve up storage, basically as a service online. And if you could go back to that last slide, previous slide real quick, Adrian. That last bullet in particular, HTTP token-based authentication, another area where we're seeing in the field a lot of interest in that regard is mobile. You have a lot of mobile applications that are able to talk to Amazon S3, for example. And the way those applications are written is for token and secret. With an S3 API personality for your object store, it's very easy to integrate in and open up the data to your mobile users, just by simply serving up that personality with no change in the client at all. And this is a way that expands the boundaries of how your data can be used in the field. It opens things up tremendously.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to dive too deep in that point, we will be covering some of this in our next webinar, which goes over content delivery next week. But what John just said, when we do that, or when it's done correctly, you're able to really collapse a lot of traditional IT technologies that you would need. So things like you use less relational database. You can store metadata with the object. You don't need to go through a web server. So there's a lot of things that you no longer have to use that can radically simplify your existing architecture. And again, if you're interested in that, we're going to be doing a deep dive on that next week. So moving along to deployment options. Obviously you have all your questions, you have your network worked out, your workloads, your use cases. Well, then what are your choices as far as installing or deploying object storage? Do you want to walk people through that, John?
Sure. My joke around this is, everybody talks about a cloud, but when all is said and done, it has to run somewhere. And these questions invariably pop up during the course of an evaluation. This is a great solution. We're really excited about it. What do I need to have in place to run it? And it can be done in one of two ways. You can decide for the evaluation that you're going to set aside a set of dedicated physical equipment, and you're going to want to know, okay, do I have enough hardware to do this? Do I have the hardware that I need to have to run the storage cluster? Do I have the hardware that I need to run any of the associated API connectors to access it through other means? Can I do a combination of dedicated equipment, or can I make some of these components run as virtual machines? And that's the level of flexibility that you're looking for when you're evaluating the solution. Have you properly tuned the hardware for your use case? A lot of people don't realize this, but if you're running an object storage solution, especially like ours, a RAID controller basically is not needed. The software solution takes care of data protection itself, and you can save yourself a lot of money just by going with a simple JBOD layout. And that's something that you can leverage and take advantage of. The software is doing that work for you. In the areas of virtual machines, you may find that there are certain pieces that lend themselves better to being deployed in your current virtual machine infrastructure. We have a lot of customers in the field that deploy Swarm and its associated components within VMware ESXi. They take advantage of what they already have in place. They take advantage of being able to do vMotion and things of that nature for disaster recovery and whatnot, because they realize that those aspects of the object solution lend themselves better to that. Things that you need to watch out for when you're running virtual machines: can you lock down the storage in the virtual machines? Typically you can. It's not terribly difficult to do, but ultimately what happens is that you have a constellation of service components that may be deployed in a virtual machine, and the ultimate storage cluster itself is something that runs on physical equipment. So it ends up being a hybrid of the two. And like I say, you have flexibility to go one way or the other, or run a hybrid, but that's something you're going to want to take into account. Can I leverage existing infrastructure? Is the existing infrastructure dedicated physical equipment, or is it virtual machines? And which pieces lend themselves best to either?
Yeah, that's a good segue to the next slide, where you're really talking about the fast track for deployment practices. And one thing before we go over this slide, I just want to mention, for those who have evaluated object storage in the past, a lot of the times the conversation just goes straight into cheap and deep storage, or very mass dense storage devices. And with the innovations in interface support and protocol support, and some of the best in breed solutions, you really don't need to start with petabytes of information. You can start with tens of terabytes and scale from there. And case in point is one of our latest innovations, or one of our latest products. I really wouldn't say it's innovation. We're pre-packaging everything, but this is our new Swarm server. And can you walk people through the approach here, John? We call this the fast track for deployment best practices. Why do we say that?
Well, the reason for that is the specifications that you're seeing here, the characteristics of what amounts to a storage node for Swarm. These are characteristics that I myself and others have derived from 10 years of field deployment of Swarm with our existing customer base. And as we look at our existing customer base and we see how they're using object storage, and we see the type of resources from a hardware perspective that they're bringing to bear to support their object storage solution, there are certain common denominators that start dropping out of that constellation of customers. And what we did is we took that information and we developed a most common denominator, as it were, of what you would typically see in the field when you were deploying equipment to support Swarm. And that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing the condensation and culmination of years of best practices for deploying Swarm in the field cooked down into this appliance.
Yeah, that's good feedback. And just to point out, we have over 500 customers. We've been doing this for quite some time, so it is a lot of knowledge that is baked into this device. So instead of going out and having a library of reference architectures, we determined we still have those reference architectures, but we really focused on delivering the best price performance ratio with this device. It's not just about cheap and deep storage. This is actually meant for data that's going to continue to be used and continue to be active, but economically stored at the same time. So as far as next steps, we covered a lot of ground. John, do you want to kind of walk everyone through what we covered and then the next steps that they should take?
Yeah, as with any successful project, not just object storage, but any project in general, having your requirements well defined ahead of time is going to raise the odds of success for the project. Having a well-defined and developed test plan where all the possible stakeholders are participating in that process is going to be key. And within that, I would say, share the test plan in advance with the provider of the object storage solution, because once you've gone through that first pass, there may be things that you may still have some questions around. There may be some insights that we can provide that can say, oh, that's an interesting requirement. How do you typically handle it? And maybe we can be creative and come up with a new way to handle that particular requirement that basically improves that overall workflow or that business process within your company. And then last but not least, to discuss evaluation options with your vendors. And this kind of goes back to the whole scaling of object storage. Everybody talks about scaling up and scaling out and how big they can get. Being able to go backwards and being able to go small helps as well, because that allows your development team very, very easily, cheaply, inexpensively to turn up a representative object storage solution stack, do all the programming that they need to do against it, and do functional verification testing without having to go and incur a large outlay up front for a large pool of equipment or expanding your virtual machine infrastructure and so on. And in fact, we provide virtual machine bundles to that end that allow your DevOps teams to do that. You can play with it, you can work with it and get a feel for how it behaves and how you can best use it. And then once you know that, you can use that same environment to further develop your test plan, perhaps capture some requirements you may have missed on the first pass, and then as things become more formalized and you start wanting to scale up for size and then take into account things like performance testing and whatnot, you'll have a much better stance within the project when you get to that stage in it.
Yeah, and I think one thing to point out too is that we do have a sales environment up and running. So for those ISVs out there, or those who want to test integration, S3 integration, or even some direct integration, we have a solution online that we can go ahead and give you an account for. So that, from an evaluation perspective, it makes it even easier. You don't need to stand it up in your own data center. You can just check and verify things against an existing deployment. We'll go ahead and move to the next slide, and it's really about, there we go, Caringo being here to help. As John mentioned, we've been doing this for quite some time. With this, I'll go ahead and pop open the next polling question. Just a question that says, would you like a consultation with an object storage specialist? So would you like to talk to one of our specialists, someone like John or someone else, about your existing evaluation? We have, a lot of object storage experts in-house since we've been doing it for quite some time. Again, feel free to ask questions. I'm just going to go ahead and put up the kind of standard who we are and who we're helping slide, just to show you we've been doing this for quite some time. We started doing it in 2005. So we have focused primarily on storage software for the first decade of our existence. And as you saw, we just came out with our first appliance, which is the culmination of that decade of experience in a hardware device. We're helping some of the world's largest organizations like the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, British Telecom, and a whole host of others. But with that, we just really wanted to focus on providing you with solid information on expediting your evaluation and making your evaluation of object storage successful. Giving you the tools, giving you the questions. Hopefully, we've shared enough information to let you think about something you haven't typically thought of in your evaluation of object storage. Before we move to questions, John, do you have anything else to add? And before you answer that, I'll ask the audience to ask questions in your dialog box to your right on your screen if you have any. So John, anything else to add?
Only that I chuckled to myself when you put up that last set of integrations and customers. I don't see a single integration partner or customer there that I haven't touched. We work extensively with them. Our professional solutions team and our support team and our engineering team, all of us have extensive knowledge of how our customers use our products. And you can take advantage of that when you're working with us. And we are here to help, and we are here to get you on the fast track and to leapfrog into using object storage to solve your business needs.
Yeah, and with that, we have a number of great resources. You know, if you don't want to ask questions here, you could go to the resources section of our website. We have a number of informational videos, some really good Chalk Talk videos. You know, on our Bright Talk channel, we have some other very good informational webinars. If you're more technical, I recommend the Object Storage for Developers series. There's some very, very good information on integration and recent advancements in our SDK, and just, you know, what to think about when you are integrating not just Caringo, but any object storage solution into your application or into your workflow. We'll give people a few more minutes for questions. We seem to answer the only question during the webinar. And again, I'll just point to the attachments that we have. Give people a few more seconds to go ahead and vote. And with that, anything else to close with, John? You've been great. I appreciate all the information you shared, and I'm sure the audience does too.
Nothing to add. Glad to help, and certainly I'm looking forward to having some of the audience members contact us and start working with us on their upcoming object storage projects. We're more than happy to assist.
Yeah, and you can see the contact information there on the thank you screen, but you know, we're very approachable. You can reach me at Adrian, ADRIAN, @Caringo.com. And, you know, if you'd like, you can also reach out to John and ask him a question. Would you like to share your email address, John?
Sure, pretty simple. John, John, dot, B as in boy, ELL, @Caringo.com.
All right, and with that, I would like to thank everyone for your time, and we hope to hear from you soon. Once again, thanks, John, and thank you to the audience for sticking around with us.
Thank you.